Hi traders, in this lesson we're going to cover while loops. So in the previous lesson we covered for loops. A while loop is pretty much identical to a for loop. The only difference is it doesn't count. It just loops. And it loops using a Boolean value. And so long as that Boolean value is true, the while loop will continue to loop. So let's break this down in code. Let's start with a really simple example. Let's create a variable called counter and initialize it as 0. Then let's use the while operator or keyword to start our while loop. Now the way this works is we say while x is true, do y. So we could just write here true, and then we can increment our counter variable by 1. Now you could say assign counter to counter plus 1, or you can use the plus equals operator and just put 1 in there. And this will do exactly the same thing. This will increment counter by 1. And then let's plot this counter variable at the end of our while loop. Let me save this code. And now we get an error. See this little exclamation mark up here? The reason we're getting an error is because our while loop never exited. We were stuck in this while loop forever and ever and ever, because true is always true forever. And nowhere in our while loop do we set this condition to false, or do we break out of the while loop. And so the while loop is an eternal infinite loop that never exits, and so we never get to plot our counter variable. So if I click on this little study error icon, it says loop takes too long to execute. It took longer than half a second to execute. That's because it never exits. If I add a if statement on here and we say if counter is greater than or equal to 10, then break out of the while loop. Now when I say the script, we will be getting 10 plotting onto our chart because our counter adds up by 1 on each loop. And then once it exceeds 10 or equals 10, we break out of the loop and plot it onto the chart. So it's pretty simple to understand the while loop. It's probably arguably more simple to understand than the for loop. The main difference is that we're dealing with the Boolean value here. So one other way we could have written this code is if we get rid of this, we could have said while counter is less than 10, increment counter by 1. Now let's say the script should also be getting 10 plotting onto our chart, because as soon as the counter hits 11, the while loop exits and does not execute the code within the scope of that while loop, and then we plot that number to the chart. So this is pretty intuitive in terms of how loops work. While this is true, do this until this is no longer true, or we tell the loop to break. You can also use the continue keyword in here, or operator, or clause, whatever you want to call it, command. You can use the continue command to skip this loop the same way we could do that with for loops. So let me show you how we could convert this while loop into a bearish bar counter. So we want to count every bearish bar over our look back period. The way we do that is we could create a new variable here called red bars, set that to 0, and then under our counter code here, we could say if the closing price of our current counter is greater than the opening price of our current counter, that means we have a green bar or bullish bar, then continue. Or in other words, skip the rest of this loop, and then we could here increment red bars by 1. And now if I plot our red bars to the chart and save our script, we have converted this while loop into basically a for loop that counts how many red bars have printed over the past 11 bars, technically, because we're starting from 0, counting up to 10. That means we're counting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And since 0 counts as 1, that's actually 11 bars. But anyway, if I hover over this green current bar here, you can see it says 6. That means we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bars print bearish over the past 10 bars. So that's how while loops work. They're pretty simple. They're very similar to for loops. The main difference, as I've said, is that this is a Boolean value instead of a counting value. So in this case, we're using a counter as our Boolean variable, but this could be anything. As long as your loop doesn't get stuck calculating and it doesn't take longer than half a second to execute whatever code is in this loop, you can have this value be anything. So another example of using a while loop to do something interesting might be to count how many bars have printed onto the chart while the RSI has been overbought. So let's quickly throw an RSI onto my chart, and then we'll get the RSI value using the ta.rsi function. We'll get a default close RSI over the past 14 bars. And now we can change this clause here to say RSI of our counter is under 70, then skip our counter. And we can change this to overbought bars, just so it makes more sense. And let's save this code and see what we get drawing onto our chart. Here we go. So now we are counting how many bars printed over the past 10 bars while the RSI was overbought. So this could give us an indication of momentum. So if you see here, if I zoom in on this mountain looking thing here, as soon as our RSI goes overbought, we begin counting those bars over the past 10 bars. So here is the peak. This is where our overbought level peaked because the past 9 bars over the past 10 bars were overbought. They printed onto the chart while the RSI was overbought. After this point, the RSI is no longer overbought, and we see that number begin to drop off. One other thing we could do here is change this continue to a break. Save this code. Now we are counting how many bars print while the RSI is overbought, and as soon as it dips below overbought, so on this bar here, the RSI prints 41, and on the next bar, our counter resets to 0. So basically the RSI went overbought here, and then we had 6 bars print as overbought before the RSI dipped back below overbought levels. So those are a few use cases for the while loop. Some analysis techniques are better off using a for loop. For example, if you're using a counter variable, you're probably more suited to a for loop than a while loop, but we have the option of using both if we need to. And a while loop just gives you a little bit more control over your counter variable, and you can get a little bit more creative with how your loop executes compared to a for loop. So a while loop is just an indefinite loop, while a for loop is a definite loop and has a finite amount of times it can loop. A while loop does not have a finite amount of times it can loop, other than the fact that it needs to execute within half a second, which is quite long in computer terms. Half a second for your code to execute means you are doing quite a lot of stuff with your code, because computers are pretty quick these days, especially the TradingView servers. So as long as your code doesn't take longer than 500 milliseconds to execute, you can do anything you want with your while loop. Anyway, that's it for the while loop lesson. If I think of a useful, practical case for the while loop, I'll record a future lesson on this material where we go into more depth about while loops. But for now, that is an introduction to this feature of PineScript, and I'll see you in the next lesson.